Hột gà nướng, hột vịt lộn, hột vịt sữa, trứng cút lộn, ớt xào đây.
Hey, it's Neil, your host of a Vietnam podcast. If you know anything about me, you know I'm a massive fan of craft beer. So I'm really excited to say that we are partnered with Seven Bridges Brewing Company. Make sure you check out their newest tap room on Dong Yu Street. It's got over 40 taps of craft beer, of course including their own brews, but guest beers, and then even some wine as well if you're not a beer drinker. One of my favourite beers when I go there is their Hai Van Haze. And if you want something a bit fruitier, a bit lighter, don't miss out on the Yuzu Wheat, a really fruity and refreshing beer that won the 2023 Champion Fruit Beer of Asia. Now, one of the coolest things about Seven Bridges is their sustainability and their zero waste mission. They even turn their brewing byproducts into their signature dragon hot sauce and use the spent grain from their brewing process to make their pizza. And I'll share a secret with you. The main reason I go there is for the pizza. The slices are incredible, and there's not many places in Saigon that do pizza by the slice and then add that dragon hot sauce on top. It is amazing. Also, if you know anything about me, you know I love a discount, you know I love happy hour, so make sure you go to the Dong Yu location, which has happy hour, 30% off all draft beer from Monday to Thursday, 1 to 5 p.m. But each of the tap rooms all have their different special offers, so look them up before you go. And when you do go, make sure to let them know that I told you to go, or better still, take me with you and buy me a beer when we're there, because I love it when people buy me a beer. If you're an expat like me, you will know that finding the right health insurance can be a bit of a headache, and that's where Tenzing Pacific comes in. Being in a new country like Vietnam, look, it's so exciting, but if you know me and you've heard past podcasts, you know I never go without health insurance because it's so important and things can get tricky really fast. You need to make sure you have coverage that works both locally and internationally, and you really just don't want the hassle. So Tenzing Pacific makes it really easy. They specialize in personal health insurance for expats, and they offer plans that are customized to fit your lifestyle. And with access to a global network of hospitals and a super smooth claims process, and to me that is super important because I hate dealing with health insurance claims, then you can focus on what matters and just getting on with living your life. If you're looking for health insurance or even just a second opinion on your current plan, I would advise talking to a Tenzing advisor today. I've worked with them in the past for podcasts and at my quiz nights, and they're a really great bunch of people and their insurance is amazing. So click on the link in the description and you will get, as a Vietnam podcast listener, special pricing and, of course, top-notch services. I absolutely love living in Saigon, love living in Vietnam. The people are amazing. I know it's a cliche, but the people are really amazing. I feel younger here. I feel more energized. And if you ask a lot of the expats who've been here, they feed off that energy as well. And I feel like we're just really lucky to be here in Vietnam at a really, really special and exciting time.
Hột gà nướng, hột vịt lộn, hột vịt sữa, trứng cút lộn, ớt xào đây.
Welcome to a special episode of a Vietnam podcast with me, your host, Niall Mackay. This is the first time I've ever done an episode like this. I'm doing an Ask Me Anything. And I was so disappointed because I put out an episode a week ago. I said, send in your questions. And I got a big fat 0. It was like crickets out there, nothing. But thankfully, the power of social media, I put a couple of posts out and I had some amazing responses. So I have a list of questions to answer just for you in this special Ask Me Anything episode about a Vietnam podcast and life in Vietnam. So I'm really, really excited to bring this to you and share my experience over the last few years. I came here to Vietnam in 2015 with Adri for a vacation. We absolutely fell in love with the place, went back to New Zealand, and then immediately planned our trip to Southeast Asia. We came to Vietnam in 2016 to learn how to teach English, and we were still in love with the place. Decided we weren't going to leave. Stayed for a year, that became 2, that became 4, and it's now 8 and coming on nearly a decade. And Saigon in Vietnam is definitely a special, special place. So I'm excited to answer these questions and share them with you. I've only looked at them briefly, haven't had much of a thought, so you're getting more of a raw answer. And remember, if you want to join the Vietnam podcast community, you will be getting episodes like these before anyone else. You might be watching this right now before it's even publicly available. So go to patreon.com/a Vietnam podcast. You can join for free. You can join for as little as $1 a month. It's not about the money. It's about creating an amazing community of people who all love this podcast, who all love Vietnam and want to get together, and we're going to organize a cocktail pub crawl soon. We've done a podcast pub crawl, so you'll get invited to special events like these and you'll get episodes early as well. And I've got a whole bunch of exciting stuff planned in the future too. So make sure you go to patreon.com/a Vietnam podcast and you can become a Bop Sao Dare, which is our name for the amazing people that are already in the community. And thank you to the people who joined up just recently. It's really exciting to see you there as well, and everyone who's already part of it. So let's get started. Don't forget, if you like this podcast, follow, subscribe, turn on the notifications, all that stuff from wherever you're tuning in from. And if you really like it as well, share it and then also join the community as well. So let's get started with my first ever Ask Me Anything. And I'm excited. Thank you very much to everyone who sent me these questions. I have a lot to get through, so I will try my best. I know I'm verbose, if that's the right word, and I like to talk, but I'm going to try and answer as succinctly as I possibly can. So the first question is, how are you? I'm good, thanks. That's a great one. Yeah, I'm very, very good. I'm very well. And number 2, this is for the podcast creators out there. Do you use Riverside to record your podcasts online? I don't. I don't think I've ever used Riverside. I use Descript, which I use to edit all of my own podcasts. My team uses it, and all the podcasts that we work with, we use Descript, and they've now got an inbuilt recording tool for online episodes. So we use Descript for everything. Number 3 is 5 local habits you never imagined you would pick up, but you have since you started living in Vietnam. This is a great question, and I feel like we talked about it recently, and if you didn't see it, go back and watch my video about mostly Grab drivers, bike drivers, delivery drivers peeing in the street. And I think coming here, you try your best not to adopt the local habits like that one. So obviously I don't do that. You see people like throwing trash. Not everyone, but some people, again, that's a habit you don't want to pick up. Another one that I really don't like is when people walk into the lift when you're coming out the lift. They don't let you get out first. So that's, again, I'm giving you habits that I haven't picked up. What I have picked up though, obviously some bad driving habits. So every now and again, I'll drive down the wrong way if it's just quicker to nip down that way. I don't do it very often. You did see a video of me not wearing a helmet very briefly. That's very, very rare. That's definitely not a habit I've picked up. They have on the traffic lights here, they actually show you the countdown timer. So you speed up when you see the timer going down, and that's a really bad habit. They're talking about taking away the timer, which at first I was like, no, but actually it kind of makes sense because you do speed up when you see that timer going down. So that's a bad habit I've definitely picked up. Was that 2 I've given you? 3 is using too much plastic. So I really try and not use plastic containers. I have a metal cup and I try my best to use that when I'm going out for coffee. But there is the odd time like this morning when I was out and I didn't have it with me. And so I used a plastic cup. And I feel like that's something now we should be moving away from that. If I lived in New Zealand, I probably wouldn't be using plastic cups ever. But definitely using too many plastic cups. Too many plastic bags, not too much, but sometimes using a plastic bag as well. So that's quite bad as well. And my 5th habit, is that 5? I've lost count already, but I'll give you this one anyway. I think this is 5. In the theme of a lot of the podcasts that I've done lately, drinking a beer in the street. And that's just something that obviously legally you're not allowed to do that. So you just wouldn't do it in most Western countries, wouldn't do that in Scotland, wouldn't do it in New Zealand. You'd probably get in trouble pretty quickly. And I've made a joke about that before when I was doing stand-up. But being in Asia or being in Vietnam, there's no laws against it. People aren't irresponsible. There's not hordes of people walking down the street all drinking alcohol or beers. So it's just a different culture here. You can have a beer and walk down the street with it. Nobody's going to blink an eye as long as you're not misbehaving. But even there was just this week, I was out and we drank a beer on the way to go get food. And we're just walking on the street, walking the dogs, not harming anyone. But even then I was like, man, it's pretty weird. And I remember when my parents came to visit 8 years ago now, wow. Even they had a beer in the street and they loved it. They're like, wait, we can just buy a beer in the shop and walk down the street. So it's definitely a habit that I don't even know if any other Vietnamese people have it, but I've picked it up since living here. So I think that's 5. Okay. That's a good question though. Number 4, if someone told you 6 years ago that you would have started your own global reaching, Yeah, I mean, if somebody had told me I had my own podcast business, never mind it was award-winning with a global reach, I would probably be like, yeah, right, whatever. I would never have imagined it. You know, I do things without thinking, and I started this podcast just for fun, for myself, because I love podcasts and I was bold. And if you told me 6 years ago when I started that this podcast had won awards, I would probably not have believed you at all. Have a global reach? Yeah, I'd be like, yeah, podcasts are global. I would have hoped and expected, especially being from overseas. But if you told me 6 years ago that I would have started my own global reaching and award-winning podcast business, I think it's one of those things where you'd be like, oh yeah, don't be crazy, that's stupid. But probably in the back of my mind, I would be thinking like, yeah, maybe. I didn't plan for it, but I would have thought maybe it could happen. And now it has happened. And that's pretty awesome. That's a great question. Thank you. Number 5, how has Vietnam changed in the last 6 to 7 years? And is it a good thing? Well, I talk about it a lot on this podcast, and so I don't want to repeat myself too much. That was part of the reason why we went on a long break, because I just felt I was repeating myself all the time. And in every episode, I'm talking about how much Vietnam has changed. I guess I need to qualify that as well always. That I mean, I've been in Saigon the whole time. It's not Vietnam. It's totally different. But Saigon has changed just massively in terms of infrastructure, more buildings, more roads, more cars. I think it's just, I don't know if the people have changed. I assume they have, you know, like yesterday I had a team lunch with 2 of my team members and they're like 22 and 23. And even as we were talking, I said, when I came here, you were 14, you were 15. And so I think that that's the biggest change is, I mean, when we came here, if there was a 10-year-old, they're 18 now. So I think that generation is changing massively in their expectations, and they've been exposed to YouTube and the world. And I think those people are changing the most. Is it a good thing? I mean, change is always good and bad, right? I think in terms of the building of the roads and the infrastructure, it's good. Economically, it creates jobs, brings Vietnam into the future. It's bad. There's so much pollution right now. It has environmental destruction. But then at the same time, when I see a new development going up, I'm like, well, it's better than all the trash that's everywhere as well. But no, it's definitely a bad thing. So it's good and bad. But overall, I definitely think it's a good thing for Vietnam. And it's exciting to see it for the Vietnamese people because they've come from mass starvation, I think it was in the 80s, mass poverty. And it's still a poor country. There's inequality, but there's more and more people with wealth now, the growing middle class, which gives them more opportunities. And it's at the end of the day, it's for the people, right? You want the people to have a good life. Because I get really frustrated when you hear people like lament about the past. And they're like, oh, I remember when you used to be able to get a bowl of pho for 5,000 dong. Oh, it was so romantic. You know, maybe they don't say it was romantic, but they romanticize the past. And I've been guilty of that as well when I've said things like, oh, I wish I'd been in Southeast Asia 20 years ago, or I wish I'd been in Vietnam 20 years ago to see what it was like. And part of me thinks that. But then you also have to remember when that bowl of pho was 5,000 dong, yeah, that's good for you, but for the person selling it, was it good for them? Did they have any money? Did their family have any money? What was the outlook for their family at that time? So we have to be careful when we think about like, oh, I wish I was here in the past. Yeah, maybe that was good for us because we had more money as foreigners or as expats, but was it good for the people? So Vietnam changing, is it good for the people? Yeah, I think it is. All right, next question. Number 6, can you share your journey to winning the best interview podcast in Asia and winning audio producer of the year? The journey, I mean, that's a 5-year journey. A 6-year journey nearly, so I could talk for a long time about that. But just to give you basically an overview of how we won that podcast. So it was the Radio Days Podcasts Awards, and they have them in Europe and Australia and in Asia as well. And so I saw these awards come up and I thought to myself, why not nominate myself? As I said, I'm a bit of a doer. I don't think too much. Some of the work we've done on them, I'm just really, really proud of. And the one I'm most proud of is the Red Lines podcast. I started working with them nearly a year ago. I think about a year ago now. Do you want to start your own podcast, or you want to take your existing podcast and turn it from average to amazing? Then listen to Smarter Podcasting with me, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. I'll give you expert tips and insider strategies to make your show stand out. I also talk to podcasting pros like Ariel Nissenblatt, Sam Sethi, and Adam Shively. You'll learn the secrets of growing your audience, improving your content, and turning listeners into loyal fans. Just search Smarter Podcasting and start making the best podcast possible today. And they wanted to share the story of architecture. So go on my website, 7millionbikes.com, go check out the Red Lines podcast under the clients and shows, and you can see what we did there. And that was one of the first podcast where I was really hired to create a narrative and a story. And so I could take the raw audio and then move things around. I added music, and the proudest thing that has ever happened maybe in podcasting was, you know, when you listen to a podcast, like a true crime podcast, and they have an interview and then they stop and then they have a narration from the host, and he's like, you know, blah, blah, blah. Did you hear that? And they add that. Man, that's a terrible example, but they add to the storyline. And I've never done that before, really, with a Vietnam podcast, and I did a little bit with Smarter Podcasting, but I would leave these notes for Jake and Aaron and say like, oh, maybe you should say this. And I'm not an architect, never done architecture, and so I didn't think that. It was a suggestion, right? And then the first episode, they literally recorded almost word for word what I wrote, and I was like, oh shit, like I know what I'm talking about, and they believe in what I'm doing, and I was able to, you know, take in what I was listening to, and then say like, I think you should say this at this point, and they would. And so that was one of the coolest things, and so that was the sample that I sent in for the Audio Producer of the Year award. And I make it to KL for the awards ceremony, but I had a couple of friends there that I knew that in the industry, and they were keeping me updated. They were messaging me, and they messaged me, and they were like, you've just won Podcast of the Year. And I was like, wait, the best interview podcast in Asia. And I was like, oh my God, my mind was buzzing. I was like, this is absolutely incredible. So excited about that. But then I really, really wanted to win the Audio Producer of the Year, because it was more than just a Vietnam podcast. It was for the work, because the submission that I put in wasn't just for Red Lines. I put in like samples of this podcast, of every other podcast, not every other podcast, but lots of the other podcasts that we worked on. Erin from Red Lines actually had to write a testimonial, which was so amazing that she did that, backing up why I should win the Audio Producer of the Year. So a few minutes later, I then got another text, and they were like, you've just won Audio Producer of the Year. And I remember I screamed out, I nearly collapsed. I was like, oh my God, like this is incredible. Went and got some champagne right away because we were out. And that can't get any better than that, really. Like, you win Audio Producer of the Year. Like, even now and again, you doubt yourself. And you're like, is this any good? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Is it good? And you obviously, like, I'm an indie podcaster. I'm not working with the BBC or Wondery or any of the big corporations or anything like that. So then to be validated and told that you're doing a good job and you're creating something that other people enjoy, it's just one of the best feelings of the world. So I guess that's a little bit of the journey to winning the best interview podcast and Audio Producer of the Year. But thank you for that question. Can you describe the moment you realized, this question 7, can you describe the moment when you realized the podcast was gaining real traction? Yeah, absolutely can. So I started with no expectations, and honestly, I thought if 10, 15 people listen to this, that would be cool. I had bought one microphone. I was using GarageBand on my Mac. It wasn't costing me any money. It was just fun. It was a hobby. Just didn't think much about it at all. And then the first episode got, I think, 150 views, downloads, listens in the first week. And I was like, whoa, that's pretty cool. And every podcaster will tell you, I think they all do the same thing in the beginning. You just keep hitting refresh and just kind of slowly watching it go up, or maybe not in some cases. And I've made podcasts that it doesn't go up. But it was just every day, every 5 minutes, it was going up. And I was like, whoa, this is crazy. And then it just kind of continued from there. But obviously you always compare yourself to other people. And you're thinking like, is this any good? I don't really know. And I can't remember the exact moment. It might have been like 2 years into it, a year into it. I can't remember, but I found this stat of what podcast got as a download, basically. And it showed that if you get 50 downloads, I think it is, per week, you're in the top 50% of podcasts worldwide. Oh, and then, sorry, I forgot, before that, there's a website called listennotes.com, and I went on there and you could find your podcast. the downloads that you got. And they said that a Vietnam podcast was in the top 10% of podcasts worldwide. I was like, wait, what? So do I remember that the moment it was gaining real traction? That was the first time when I saw that top 10%. And I still didn't fully believe it because I saw a lot of people say the same thing, like their podcast was in the top 10%, and they didn't really seem to explain why. But then when I found that stat about how many downloads and what percentage you were, and I was like, so okay, I'm not in like the top 1%, the top 5%. From that, probably in the top 20, 25%. I'm not exactly sure where listen notes. I think they're doing it on the total listens that you get per week, which for me, because I've got such a big back catalog, the total listens is more than the like individual episodes. So the individual episode in the first 7 days might get 150 listens, but the whole amount of listens in that week will be like 500 or 600 because people are listening to all the old episodes as well. So those were the first moments when I realized like, oh, okay, right, this podcast is gaining real traction. So that was really cool. So yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really good one. Number 8, can you share a memorable story / experience from one of your podcast episodes? I can, and it was with Suzanne T. Hien Hook, who'd been recommended to me by a listener because he'd read her story in the media, and he was like, you should contact this woman, and it would be great to have her on your podcast. And it was during lockdown times, so it was all on. She was in the UK, so it was all online anyway. But her story is incredible. So you go back and listen to that podcast, Suzanne with a Z, Suzannet, Hien Hook, and yeah, her story is really, really tragic. So she was abandoned under a bush during the Vietnam War as a baby and found by a local orphanage or a monastery and taken to an orphanage. And she was the child of Black and Asian parents. And as she described on the podcast, she never met her parents. She assumes that her dad was a Black soldier. Her mum was a Vietnamese woman. She didn't know if she was a product of rape, of a one-off fling. But all she knew was that she was left under a bush and sent to an orphanage. And then the tragedy continues where she was adopted to great fanfare by this British family, religious family. And it was like, oh, amazing. Look, they're helping this child. They're bringing her to the UK so she can have an amazing upbringing. And she had a really, really, it's just a horrible upbringing. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Go listen to the episode to get all the details. But like a really, really horrible upbringing. So really, really memorable story. And then what came out of that was, so I'm talking about this just yesterday with somebody. It's the only time I ever cried, I think, on a Vietnam podcast. I couldn't hold back the tears. There was another time where I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I couldn't hold back the tears this time. And what she said, it's lived with me forever. To this day, it still lives with me. She said that she didn't know what it felt like growing up to be loved. And I just couldn't comprehend that, right? So I've had an upbringing like many people. My parents divorced. They didn't get on. We had no money, little money, but life was good. We were in a good neighborhood, went to a good school. I went to university. I have no real complaints about my upbringing, but it was still tough, right? It wasn't like amazingly easy and loads of fun all the time, but it was good. And when she said that, what it made me realize was I did not know what that feeling was to be unloved. So no matter how difficult my childhood was, no matter what I went through, I never ever felt unloved. I felt love from my mum, from my dad, from my sister, from my grandparents and my family. And I was like, I'm so lucky. Like, how lucky can you be to grow up to feel like that? Like, that is incredible. And so at that time, I would have been, I guess, 39 because I made it my point on my 40th birthday. Called my mum and called my dad separately. Obviously, they're separated. But I managed to hold it together. And I told them both separately. I said, look, I know I had a difficult upbringing, but I did this podcast where this woman said that she never knew what it felt like to be loved. And I'm nearly crying now telling you this. I want to share with you guys that I never felt unloved. And I want to thank you both for that because that's an incredible thing that you did for me. So thank you very much. So that's definitely my most memorable story / experience from one of my podcast episodes. So yeah, it's an awesome question. Thank you very much. Number 9, how does Vietnamese humor compare to British humor? That's such a great question. So I've been here for a long time, but I'm not like integrated into the Vietnamese community. And that's something as an expat, even when I lived in New Zealand, you're not fully integrated into New Zealand society because you're always going to be an expat. So this is my opinion from a distance and also just from learning or hearing from other people. I think the biggest difference, and this may have changed now though, is that traditionally anyway, Vietnamese humor was all about slapstick. And so just slapping somebody in the face when they're in a funny costume would get like a massive laugh. That's what I heard anyway. So then just things like a man dressing up as a woman would get like such big laughs. That's just hilarious. Things that now in the UK, yeah, maybe in the 70s would have been funny. Even the 90s, you think about like Ace Ventura, the whole punchline of the whole movie was that the female was a man. So, but I think that's what I've learned. Traditionally, Vietnamese humor was like really based on slapstick and costumes and things like that. Whereas obviously British humor is so nuanced, right? And so cringe sometimes and awkward. And I mean, it's just, there's such a depth of range to British humor from The Office to all the way back to Monty Python. So I think that's the main differences though, but I do think that's changing again with the younger generation. They've grown up with stand-up comedy. They know what stand-up comedy is. We now have in Saigon TU, which are Vietnamese comedians doing stand-up comedy, which I'd heard had never really been done before. So I think that's the main difference, is the slapstick nature of it. All right, number 10. Have you ever had any misunderstandings in Vietnam that led to funny situations? I actually was just sharing this story yesterday. So this happened not long after Adrian and I had arrived in Vietnam. Like, we'd only been here a few weeks, and we went out for some tofu and some rice, and it was really good. It was really delicious. But we couldn't eat it all. It was like a mound of rice, a mound of tofu, and we wanted to take it home with us. So as you may or may not know, in the UK, we call it like a takeaway. Like, do you want to go get a takeaway tonight? Which means go get food to bring home. In America, they would say to go. You want to get it to go? Or I guess when they finish their meal, be like, can we get this to go? Whereas in the UK, we'd be like, can I get this takeaway? So we wanted this food to bring home with us. So I put into Google Translate takeaway. I didn't do a sentence. I just did the word takeaway. And it translated it, and I showed it to the server, and they picked up the food and they took it away. And then we were waiting for like 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 10 minutes. And they weren't bringing it back. And he was like, I don't think they're bringing it back. And I was like, no, they will. They'll just be trying to find a container. Don't worry. We waited, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. I looked at the translation, and takeaway translated to lady. And it was when I realized, like, I didn't ask them for it to go. I've just asked them to take it away. And that's exactly what they did. I showed them, I said, take away, lady. They picked it up. They took it away. They probably threw it straight in the trash because we asked them to take it away. Didn't realize that I should have put, can we get this takeaway? Or I should have just said to go. And it changes it to mang đi or mang về, which means I want it to go home. And it would have avoided that situation. But it was pretty funny. We laughed pretty hard about it at the time. There's probably been loads more since then, but I just remember telling this story yesterday. So we'll stick with that one. That's a pretty good one. All right, number 11. What strange or maybe considered unusual habits have you picked up whilst living in Vietnam? For example, while living in China, I started drinking hot water as all the locals do, whatever the weather. That's a good example, and that really helps me answer this question. A strange or unusual habit I picked up living in Vietnam is drinking iced tea with coffee. I love it. Like, I absolutely love it. So here you call it cha da. Generally, you go out for a coffee. Before your coffee even comes, you're going to get a cup of iced tea. And it's just one of these things that is so strange, like getting a cup of iced tea with your hot coffee. Or there's one coffee shop I go to, they give you the temperature of the tea matches your order. So if you get a hot coffee, they give you a hot tea. If you get a nice coffee, you get a nice tea, which there's not many places I've been to that do that. But that's definitely an unusual habit, to have tea with your coffee. The other one, I guess, and I've posted this on social media before, and I still think it's hilarious, is having like a pork chop or a beef stew for breakfast, or like pork noodles. Like this week I had bun thịt nướng, which is basically pork noodles. So having something like that, you know, and if I went back to Scotland and my mum was like, what do you want for breakfast? And I was like, can I get some pork and rice? She'd be like, what are you talking about? You want cereal, or do you want yogurt or toast? What do you mean you want pork and rice? Or can I get some beef stew? But bò kho is one of the best things for breakfast, right? And so that's definitely an unusual habit that I picked up while living here, but a good one. All right, number 12. What's one Vietnamese phrase you've learned that has saved you in awkward situations? That's a good question as well. I would say the best phrase I've learned is "Kom hiu," which I'm probably not even saying right, but it just means I don't understand. So just being able to say to a Vietnamese person, I don't understand, and then they look at you and they go, oh, he's an idiot, doesn't speak Vietnamese. But that's been the most helpful. Kom hiu. Number 13, what is the most unexpected or unusual thing that you've learned from a guest on your podcast? That's a great question. I think the most unexpected thing was AJ Miller, who has just got back to Vietnam and I was just talking to today. So she is just a superstar. She's good at everything and she's a hilarious comedian as well. And so we performed together a lot. And at that time, I think it was like the second season, I was having a bunch of comedians on because like I had access to them. And she was one of them and I thought we were going to have just like a really fun conversation. And I mentioned how there was one other time I nearly cried, but I managed to keep it in, and that was this episode. And yeah, I thought we were going to have a really fun time, and she shared her story of how she ended up in Vietnam, which I actually didn't know at the time. And so basically her father was a soldier in the Vietnam War and a self-admitted killer and felt terrible about it and had actually passed away of Agent Orange-induced leukemia, and she'd helped him and nursed him in his dying days, basically. And she'd come back to Vietnam with his dog tags and to follow in his footsteps to kind of learn more about what he'd gone through. And she shared this in detail in the episode, so I would recommend going back to find it. And she was just amazed at the beauty of the Vietnamese people and how accepting they were, and she thought that they were going to be horrible to her, I guess. I can't think of a better word, sorry, because it is quite dark. But that, I was just not expecting that. I thought we were going to have like a really fun conversation, and instead it went down a really emotional route. And I was so glad. This is what I love about this podcast, and what I love about podcasting is you get to talk to people about things that you would probably never ever talk about in real life. And this is an example. You know, I know AJ fairly well. I don't think ever we would sit down over a drink, having a laugh and be like, so tell me, why did you come to Vietnam, and tell me about your dad? And there's been so many guests that it's really similar. So for me, it's just been one of the best ways to get to know a little bit more about people and then share that with you as well, so that you get to know the story behind people. And that really was the impetus why I started a Vietnam podcast, because there was so many people in Saigon that I was meeting, and you would start to scratch the surface a little bit and you're like, oh, you have like a really interesting story. And I wanted to share those stories on a Vietnam podcast. And I think we've done that. So that is a good question. And yeah, that was the most unexpected thing I've learned from a guest. All right, number 14. And these are no particular order. I've not put names to who they are. But number 14, what are the fun facts that you know about Vietnam that even Vietnamese people don't know? Man, that is a good question, because I don't know what Vietnamese people don't know. But I was just thinking, I mean, there's often times where I'll be with Ton, who's coming up in season 11, who's my personal trainer, or we had lunch yesterday, and now I'm trying to remember what are some of the things that I maybe talk about. And I'm like, do you know this? And then they'll be like, no. What are the fun facts that you know about Vietnam that even Vietnamese people don't know? If you want to dive deeper into our community of passionate listeners, then we have restarted our Patreon so that we can build a community of people, and we're calling that community the Bop Sao Dares. You can choose a level that suits you. You can become a Cafe Suada, a Banh Mi, a Com Tam, a Bun Tet Nung, or the ultimate level, you can become a Bop Sao Day. Join the fun with me and let's explore Vietnam together like never before. So hit that link in the show notes and join my podcasting adventure of a Vietnam podcast today. Cheers. Can't think of anything off the top of my head that's a good answer. Maybe the fact that Vietnam is like the third biggest producer of coffee in the world. I don't know if Vietnamese people know that. Yeah, sorry. I don't have a good answer to that one. If I think of it, I'll come back to it. All right. First one I haven't had a good answer for. So yeah, that's the first one. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry. You know what's going to happen tonight? I'll be lying in bed and then I'll be like, oh man, I think of that. I thought of that answer. So if I do, I'll add it back in later. I probably won't. Number 15, how has living in Vietnam changed you? Also, you said you were vegetarian, and how was that changed in Vietnam? So how has living in Vietnam changed you? I mean, it's changed my whole life. Everything has changed. It's crazy. I don't think of myself as a different person, but I mean, not every aspect, but so many aspects have changed. So obviously I have a podcast now. I've done stand-up comedy for the first time, which was a dream for years, long before I came to Vietnam. I always dreamt of getting on stage, doing stand-up comedy, and I never ever had the courage to do it. It was really, really difficult to get up and do it, but I did it. So that's changed. Even I think if you listen to more than just this episode, if this isn't your first episode, and you've heard other ones, you'll know I've talked about it before. I mean, I was bullied when I was younger for being skinny. I've always been really, really thin. And when I got to Vietnam, it's terrible to look back at pictures. I was 63 kgs when I left New Zealand. I was so underweight and I was trying my best. I was doing weights. I was eating loads of tofu and eggs and cheese and pea protein powder, but just nothing worked and I couldn't put on weight. And then after being here for not that long, signed up for another gym, decided to start eating meat, followed a fitness program, which was not like a fitness program, like you weren't going to go run a marathon. It was like a bodybuilding program for skinny people. And I managed to put on a lot of weight. And I think the heaviest I've gotten was 88 kgs. I'm down to about 78 right now. But that's just massively life-changing. So even now I see myself in the mirror. Most people probably wouldn't notice a difference because I'm not like suddenly super muscly or super big. I'm still I always think of myself as still slender and thin. But yeah, I mean, that's just been the biggest change. Everything else is the same. Habits, music, clothes, none of that's changed. And then obviously eating meat. So that was part of that story of, I was a vegetarian for 10 years. I was a vegan for about 3 days during that. Adri became vegetarian when we met as well, and that was for environmental reasons, economic, treatment of animals, all of those things. Everything I was like, I should become a vegetarian. Everything I read about was like, it's a good thing to do and a good thing for the environment and the world. And it turned out for me, it wasn't good at all. I think because I have a naturally thin body, I went to a doctor's and they did like a bioanalysis and I was like 25%, my muscles were 25% less than what they should be because I just wasn't getting enough protein in my body. I was starting to eat my own muscles, basically, like get the protein from my muscles. And so I also had some other health issues. And then I started eating meat and pretty much most of those health issues went away. I got bigger, I got healthier. Everything has become better for me. So I eat meat, but with a bit of guilt. Adrian will tell you there's no guilt involved. I do enjoy it. It tastes good. But I think coming to Vietnam as well, there's so much pork here. Cơm tam is one of my favorite foods now. I mentioned bun thịt nướng, bò kho is beef. Just that if you don't eat meat here, especially 8 years ago, the vegetarian food was mostly just fried, congealed stuff, which tastes delicious, but not healthy either. So there was really a choice of for me and Adrian was, do we eat meat and give up some of our values and maybe be unhealthy, or do we eat meat and be healthier? And that was the choice that we had to make. So that was a big difference, becoming a vegetarian. Number 16, how have you built your social circle here? By having a podcast. No, but that does help. It's something I think I've talked about before. It's really, really difficult to build a social circle as an expat, not just in Vietnam. When we were in New Zealand, we had one Kiwi friend in our social circle, and he wasn't from Wellington. He was from the South Island, so even he probably found it difficult. It's not that easy to just move to a new country, a new city, where people have known each other maybe from school and then just fit into that group. And so similar here in Vietnam, what makes it even more difficult is it's quite a transient population. So we've had some really good friends, but they're only here for a year or two and then they leave and they stay your friends, but your social circle disappears. And I remember when we first came here, someone said to us, if I haven't known somebody for more than a year, I don't go to the leaving party. I think that was the criteria. And I didn't really get it at first, but now I do. And, recently we started making some friends with people, but you keep them at arm's length. And sure enough, they leave and now they're gone. And you're kind of like, I'm kind of glad I didn't invest that time into that friendship, which is so sad. But it's a great question. Thanks for that one. Number 17, what do you do for fun and relaxation? Well, if you listen to this podcast, I like to go out, have a drink, have some fun, and just socialize, be with friends. For relaxation, meditate. No, I'm kidding. I don't meditate. I should. I do like to go for massages though. That's always good. That's one of the few times that I can actually kind of shut off my brain and just spend an hour relaxing. So that's always good. And then I mentioned before, we like to try and just do fun things that, that don't involve drinking. So We did mini golf, or there's the 3D golf. We've done dance lessons recently. We've done pottery classes, or like a class. We made pottery. I mean, these are all kind of isolated things. Going to the movies as well. That's another good one. That is an opportunity to just relax and shut off your brain. And we were going to do an episode about that, just how this is maybe something that surprises people who've not been to Vietnam, or if you don't know if you live here. Like, there's so many modern things that are just the same as the West. So we have really nice movie theaters, maybe nicer than back home, popcorn, Coke, all of the things that you want at the movies. And of course, it's much cheaper as well. The only problem is movies come and go here really quickly. I don't know if that's still the same in Scotland or the rest of the world, but here a movie will come out, and even if it's pretty popular, within like 2 weeks, it's gone. So if you want to see a movie, you've got to go see it right away. But yeah, I mean, there's just so many cool bars to go to. There's so much food to eat here, like different cuisines. There's always events on. And I mean, I do my quiz night every Tuesday night, and that's the highlight of my week. Maybe that's so fun. So I do love that. So yeah, lots of different things, probably not much different than any other city. The biggest thing we miss is when we lived in New Zealand, we were right in the middle of nature. So you could just go out your door after work and go for a beautiful walk up Mount Victoria, or in the countryside, or the countryside if you want to call it that, but in nature. Whereas here, the pollution's bad. There's not really many places to go. And even if there was, it's hot and it's humid and it's polluted. So unfortunately, we don't do things like that. Number 18, how do you stay connected with your home country? Well, I mean, my home country, my home is New Zealand, more than Scotland. And I stay connected to there by listening to New Zealand radio every morning. When I wake up, I put on the delayed morning breakfast show, which means they'll be saying, oh, it's 6:30 in the morning and it's 6:30 here. So that's always really cool. Get to hear all the news and the updates. A lot of it is stuff you just don't need to know about. How many road cones there are in Auckland, or the latest delay in the tunnel. But it's nice to be part of that, hearing them talk about sports and the latest comings and goings. Listen to some podcasts about New Zealand, and members of some Facebook groups still that I joined when I was in New Zealand, and still a member. So you get that update. And then obviously messaging people, even back home in Scotland and home in New Zealand, the messaging apps these days, WhatsApp and Messenger and all those apps, just make it so easy to stay in touch and talk to people. So I think it makes you feel more connected than ever. When I lived in Australia in the 2000s, which sounds so old when I say that, but like the late 2000s, so like 2007 to 2011, I didn't really keep in touch with my family that much at all. We didn't have, it makes I can sound so old. We didn't have like all the messaging apps and things like that like we do nowadays, or they went as, group chats and things like that. Like everyone I know has a family group chat, and so we didn't have that. But so I remember actually going long spells without talking to anyone even. But now with the internet and apps, it's so much easier to stay connected. But definitely big shout out to Radio Hauraki in New Zealand. That really helps me keep connected to that country. Number 19, what are your plans, and do you see yourself living in Vietnam long term? Well, plans are not to go anywhere in the near future. COVID obviously just changed everything for everyone, and so we didn't probably think that we'd be here this long. Maybe we would have been, who knows? Obviously I lost my job during COVID. Adri changed jobs during COVID, and that everything around that, staying in Vietnam for 2 or 3 years before we could leave, just completely changed the world, obviously. And now it's been up and down. COVID was such a massive downright, and it's had such an impact on everyone's lives. But now we're settled here, and that sounds weird to say that after we've been here for so long, but I think I've explained maybe in other episodes, if you go back and listen to us talking about our expat life and how we ended up here. We've lived like 8 different lives in 8 years here almost. Our life has changed so much in that time here. It's not been consistently the same, and so the plans have obviously changed. But I think for the immediate future, we'll be here in Vietnam with no plans to leave. It's always difficult because there's no long-term plan. There's no long-term path to residency here. Like in New Zealand, we got our permanent residency within 4 years because we applied for it. We had the points, and then you could get that. Whereas here, even I met somebody recently who'd been married to a Vietnamese woman, I think for 25 years. They had a son who's in his early 20s, if I remember correctly. And really, really sad. His wife had unfortunately passed away. And he still has to apply for a visa now. He still doesn't get granted residency of any sort. He's not, he still has to go through the formal process of applying for a visa. So that makes it really difficult. in Vietnam. I've never heard of any plans for that to change, but I mean, they could be. I just might not have heard of it, but that would be good. And if they change that, I would absolutely apply for a long-term visa. And we're going to be here for the foreseeable future because Vietnam's and, well, Saigon especially is our home now. Our friends are here. We have family here. And we've no immediate plans to leave.
Hello, I'm Steve Ahern, one of the judges of the Asia Podcast Awards. I'm interrupting this episode to let you know that you're listening to an award-winning podcast. This podcast won its category in the 2024 Podcast Awards, so you know you're listening to quality. Enjoy your listening experience, and congratulations to the team who created this award-winning podcast for you.
Number 20, what advice would you give to new expats moving to Vietnam? Well, so I'm going to assume if they're an expat, they're here for, maybe a short-term contract, 2 to 3 years. They've been sent here by their work. The biggest question is going to be, do you have kids or not? That obviously you're going to want lots of advice about that. I don't have any advice to give about kids, but what advice would you give to new expats moving to Vietnam? It'd be really boring. Make sure you have health insurance sorted, all of that stuff. Decide where you live. Big tip I would give is wherever you choose to live, go and do like a recce before you sign any lease as much as you can. And it's always impossible to know what a place is going to be like until you move in, because there could be neighbours playing music at 10 at night that you're never going to know. But we've done it before when we've looked at apartments. We've gone in the morning to check to see if there's any schools in the neighbourhood, because we've had that before, that there was a school across the road. And we didn't realise that at 6 a.m. every morning they were blasting out a tannoy, doing exercises. That's how we learnt to count, because all we could hear across was the teacher yelling into the speaker, "Mop, hi, ba, bo," and just on repeat. I guess they were doing jumping jacks or something, God knows. Then construction is a big problem here because there's a lot of construction, and we've even had problems here in this really nice building because suddenly the apartment above wants to knock down all the walls. So that you can't legislate for things like that. But we've definitely went to look for apartments and gone around in the middle of the day, not lunchtime because the construction will be off at lunchtime. Go and check, are there any construction sites? I remember there was one place we looked at in Phu Nhan, had a nursery, a school and a construction site all next to it. And so the apartment was really nice. I think we saw it at like 7 in the evening and we're like, oh yeah, this could be okay. But we went back and checked it out and yeah, it wasn't for us. So yeah, my biggest piece of advice to new expats is wherever you decide to move into, unless you're in like a compound or a big building that doesn't have much around it, go and check out the surrounding areas. Number 21, how did you imagine yourself living in Vietnam before coming here, and what is it like now? Well, I guess I'd been here on a holiday, right? So when we got here, that was only a year later. So I didn't imagine living in Vietnam. Probably, it's hard to answer because I told you life has changed so much. So we first came here as like a backpacker, and we were just talking about this on the weekend, drinking like 10 dong LaRue's, which is like less than 50 cents for a beer. And then you would see like craft beer for 100 or 110,000 dong. You'd be like, oh my God, that's so expensive. But now, we have more steady jobs. We're not backpackers. We've been here for a long time. And so just things like that aren't as crazy anymore. So I don't know. I think we probably, like everyone, imagined coming to Vietnam and it's just going to be really cheap, that you're not going to spend much money. And then you realize, like, even if it's cheaper, it still costs money. It's not like, I think maybe I had this crazy notion that it was almost not free, but it was just going to be almost zero. And so even then when you come as a backpacker and you don't have much money and you realize, like, well, even if it's cheap, it still costs money, right? Living costs money. So I think that was maybe a little tiny bit of a shock. But that's my own personal fault. But I was like, oh, things cost money. It was nowhere near as cheap as we thought in terms of things like accommodation, right? So you just think, again, everything's going to be so cheap. Our first apartment was only for a month in like downtown District 1. Really nice apartment, but up at just a normal hem. It's not even a super nice location, but I guess the location was really central. And it was way more expensive than we thought for the size of it. And when we started to look at different apartments in District 1, we're like, I know it's downtown Saigon, but so we had that mentality though that just everyone was cheap. And then when we looked at the apartments in D1, you're like, oh, these are quite expensive. And that's why people live in D7 and D2 and D4, and we ended up moving to D4 after a while. And so what's it like now? Going on about the same things all the time, the construction, the building, it's just changed so much. There's so many nice buildings to choose from. Our life has changed in just so many ways, partly because of our circumstances. We came, I would say, literally as backpackers, hadn't worked for 3 months. Then we're living off a teacher's salary, which many people might know, you might not, but like a English language teacher's salary is okay, and you get paid more than many locals, but there's also many locals that get paid way more than you as well. You can see by the Porsches and the Lamborghinis that go around as well. So I think it's like an okay salary for a short time, and we moved out of that within like a couple of years. And once our salaries changed, obviously our lifestyle has changed, and we can enjoy a different side of Vietnam or a different side of Saigon. We can travel more, which we didn't in the beginning. We traveled, I guess, a little bit, but travel costs money as well. And I think one of the best things about living in Saigon is it's such a central hub. So I was just talking to Huyen and the team, and she's gone to China for the first time, which is so cool. And that's her first time out of the country. And I would kind of mention a couple of the countries I'd been to. And she's like, have you been to every country in Southeast Asia now? And I was like, yeah, I think I have. Even North Korea. I dipped my toe in North Korea because we got to go to the DMZ and go to the border there. So yeah, I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent now, but what is it like now? It's awesome. Can't complain at all. I absolutely love living in Saigon, love living in Vietnam. The people are amazing. I know it's a cliche, and I say it's a cliche, but the people are really amazing. I love the lifestyle here. The biggest thing that we've always said that we love is the energy in Saigon, and you can't really explain it until you get here, until you're driving down some nondescript street at 10 p.m. at night, and all the food stalls are open, all the shops are open, the traffic's crazy. And then you think to yourself, we lived in Wellington at 10 p.m, the whole city was dead and it was asleep. And even if, we are generally in bed by about 10 p.m. most nights, not on the weekend, but just to have that energy around you really helps you. And I remember mentioning to somebody the movie Cocoon, which really does date me as well. If anyone remembers Cocoon, a whole bunch of older people find some alien artifact, I think, and then it makes them feel younger. And I feel like Saigon is almost like Cocoon to me, where I feel younger here, I feel more energized. And if you ask a lot of the expats who've been here, they feed off that energy as well. And it's got its pluses and its minuses. So we talk about the craziness. There might be sometimes, I've definitely heard construction in the middle of the night. I've heard it on a Sunday morning. You get woken up at 6 a.m. by banging and construction or shouting and screaming from a school. There's pluses and minuses of that energy, and noise pollution is a real thing, and it's not just something that expats complain about. You see it in the Vietnamese news as well. It's one of the things that causes the most problems with mental health in Saigon, and that's why you do have to be really careful where you live, where you're going to set your base, because obviously you're going to live there and spend most of your time there. So if you do want to have that, something I hate when people say I want to have that authentic experience, there's no such thing as an authentic experience in Saigon. 95% of the people that live in my building are Vietnamese. So are they not living an authentic life? It's ridiculous concept. But if you do want to go and live the authentic experience, which I guess would mean living down a hem where there's chickens and a tiny road and the buildings are all completely tight together, whether that's in District 4 or D3, just be careful what you wish for where you're going, because it might be like, oh, this is such a cool, authentic experience, quote unquote. But at the same time, there might be a rooster right out your door at 6 a.m. every morning crowing. There's going to be probably a group of locals singing karaoke till 10 at night, blasting on this tiny little speaker with the echo turned up. And I've yet to really hear anyone who can actually sing using one of those things. So that's what I say, go and check it out. That was my biggest advice. But thank you so much to everyone who sent in your questions. I couldn't have done this episode without you. I hope that has shed some light on my life and our life here in Saigon. I hope you enjoyed this episode as well. And I really hope you're enjoying the Vietnam podcast. What's happened over the last year has been incredible. If you don't know already, the Vietnam podcast, well, you probably heard the ad in the middle of the episode. A Vietnam podcast won the best interview podcast in the whole of Asia, which is just absolutely mind-blowing. At the same award ceremony, I won Best Audio Producer for not only my work on a Vietnam podcast, but all the clients that we worked for as well. earlier on in the year, we won the Great Company Award at the BritCham Gala Ball. So for 7 Million Bikes podcast, for the work, I guess, that we've done in Vietnam and the podcast that we produce. And I didn't even realize how many we made about Vietnam. So we have obviously a Vietnam podcast. We make the Vietnam is Awesome one. We do the FVidinum Global Investment Group, all about getting investment into Vietnam. We've worked on You Don't Know Vietnam. Had my podcast that I used to do called Did That Really Happen? We had a whole bunch of Vietnamese comedians on there. We worked with Delta MV, a Vietnamese pharmaceutical company. And there's a few more in there that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. So we're really, really proud to be able to share Vietnam and all its amazingness with the world, whether that's about business or pharmaceutical marketing or comedians. It's so amazing, and I feel like we're just really lucky to be here in Vietnam at a really, really special and exciting time, and that's probably why we are in no rush to go anywhere soon. So thank you very much for all your support of our Vietnam podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you do want to become a Bup Sao Dare and join the community, go to patreon.com/a Vietnam podcast. And you'll get episodes like this before anyone else gets to see them as well. We're trying to build a community on there of people who are passionate about Vietnam and love a Vietnam podcast. And there's nothing I like more than just bringing people together, whether that's 3 people or 30 people. So go to patreon.com/a Vietnam podcast. Remember, turn on notifications, like it, follow it, review it, rate it, do all of that things that can help the podcast grow. It doesn't cost you any money. It takes 2 seconds. And the best thing that you can do is if you do like a Vietnam podcast, you know somebody who's coming to Vietnam or they live here, then please share this episode with them so they can be part of our community as well. So thank you very much for listening. Cheers. I wanted to share with you about one of my favorite affiliate partners, and that is Fiverr. I've been using Fiverr for years for everything from ordering YouTube thumbnails to keyword research, writing podcast articles, even to Canva designs and thumbnails and more. So whether you're a budding entrepreneur, a podcaster, or anyone in between, Fiverr has got you covered. It really is the go-to platform if you want to find freelancers offering a massive range of services to help you on any project. Maybe you need a stunning new logo or just a short animation. Whatever you need, you can find it on Fiverr. What I love the most is how easy Fiverr makes it to connect with talented freelancers from around the world, all at prices that will fit whatever your budget is. Plus, with Fiverr's secure payment system, you can trust that your transactions are safe and secure. No dodgy people you meet on Facebook groups that disappear with your money and never give you what you want. What, that's only happened to me? As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you use the link and at no extra cost to you. As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you click my link and you buy something, all at no extra cost to you. And best of all, you will be directly supporting the making of this podcast that you're listening to for free, but it is not free to make. So why wait? Head over to somewhere that you've probably never been before. It's called the show notes. So whatever app you're listening in, if it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anything at all, head to the show notes, click on my special link, and then you can browse thousands of gigs ready to help you with your next project.